Hey guys, now there's a lot of you that have been reading my blog for a while on tips and tricks and other do's and don'ts for in the kitchen, but I've never really posted a video before, and today I plan to change that. Now let's get started. Now today we're going to be making some Swedish meatballs, and this is a great recipe that I got from Alton Brown. Now the first thing that I do before I ever start cooking is to make sure I have all of my ingredients. And this recipe calls for a quarter teaspoon of ground allspice, a quarter teaspoon of ground nutmeg, a half a teaspoon of ground pepper, and a whole teaspoon of salt, a quarter cup of milk, a quarter cup of heavy cream, a quarter cup of finely chopped onions, a quarter cup of flour, 3 cups of beef broth, 2 egg yolks, 3 tablespoons of butter, 2 pieces of bread, and 1.5 pounds of beef. Now it specifically says 3/4 pounds of pork and 3/4 pounds of ground beef, but I don't really care. Now, after I make sure I have all of my ingredients, and before I start actually preparing, I make sure I have all the tools and utensils that I need. And to make sure they're all clean, make sure my work area is clean, and make sure my hands are clean. Now you might be asking yourself, well, how do you get the egg yolk apart from the egg white? And it's actually a very easy process once you know how to do it. But then again, I guess anything's easy once you know how to do it. Basically, really all you need to do is you kind of need to balance out the whites after you crack the egg. And I mean, it's actually a pretty simple process. Now, after we've done that, if the recipe requires you to preheat your oven, I would do so now to make sure it's nice and toasty by the time you need it. But before you do that, make sure there's nothing in it first. And this recipe actually requires us to preheat the oven to a relatively cool 200 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Now what this recipe is having us do is taking our 2 pieces of bread and just tearing them apart. It doesn't really give us a description on how big, because what we're going to be doing once we finish tearing the bread apart is we're going to soak it in the milk. So I think it's going to all kind of turn to a mush anyway. I know it sounds nasty, but it turns out great. Next up, we need to saute, or as Alton likes to call it, sweat our onions. Now, first what we need to do is we need to set our burner to a medium-high heat and put 1 of our 3 tablespoons of butter in the pan. Then we need to stir the butter up, get the grease nice and even. Then we're going to need to pour our 1/2 cup of onions in the pan. Going to stir those around for a little bit. And then we're going to add a pinch of salt. And we're going to stir that for a few minutes until they're nice and golden brown. Now that we have our onions sauteed and we have our bread and milk soaked, we need to add the spices, the egg yolks, gets a little messy, the ground beef, and our onions. Now we mix. Now that we've got those ingredients blended, we're supposed to weigh out 1 ounce of meat to make a meatball. But I don't have a scale, and I'm not that picky anyway, so I just grab a little handful and just make them out and roll them out. Like so. And put them on a sheet. Now that we have the meatballs rolled out, it's time to brown them. They recommend using the same skillet that you use to brown the onions in, which makes sense to keep the flavor all in the same, all the same grease and all the same flavor in the same pan. So just stir them around, get them nice, all the sides nice and brown. That should take about 7 to 10 minutes. Once you've done that, now it's time to transfer them back to the baking sheet and put them in the oven. I believe I cooked mine about 15 minutes longer in the oven at 200 degrees. Now comes the hard part, and that is making the gravy. Making a good gravy is very hard to do, but when you do, it is so worth it. A good gravy is perfect. I think a good gravy is just heavenly. So what we need to do to make ours is in the existing pan that you just used for the meatballs, with the grease and fat still in it, pour in your flour. Now I had to add a little bit more flour than they recommended because mine wasn't quite thick enough. Once you've added your flour to that grease, let it thicken a little bit. Let it boil. And that's when you start to add your beef broth gradually. Don't add too much at a time, because if you do, then it won't get to thicken properly. Add a little bit of beef broth, let it sit, stir, let it thicken. Add a little bit more, sit, stir, thicken. And once you've added almost all of your beef broth, that's when I added in my 1/4 cup of creamer. I added that in, let it sit, let it boil to a nice consistency. Now to check on our meatballs. They've been in there for about 10 or 15 more minutes. And let's see how they look. What I do is I just cut one open down the middle to see if it's done. I personally like a little bit of pink in my meatballs, so it's not all the way done. And I think those look perfect.